Hey, welcome to Partners in Ministry. I'm your host, Dan Smith, and today I'll be joined by Steve Warmer. Steve is the Executive Director of Hurt2Hope out of Memphis, Tennessee. Welcome back, Steve. Thanks for coming.
Dan, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
It is just great to see you again and get caught up. I've known over a year since we last talked, and I know a lot's been happening, so we are going to get right to it. One of the things that just impressed me as I was going through some of the resources that God has had you put together, and one of the things that you emphasize in relationships is the idea of gratitude. Talk to us just a little bit about, as you've gone through the studies, if you've gone through relationships, if you've gone through counseling sessions, what is gratitude?
How much time do you have, Dan? Gratitude.
As much as it takes for us to understand this concept.
I think the Lord wanted to show me that for a good portion of my life, I must have been ungrateful, because that theme of gratitude just keeps coming back in everything I do and every encounter I have. It is, I call it the great equalizer. Like whatever ails us, whatever we're suffering through, whatever relationship challenges we're having, whatever is over here in the negative column, gratitude has a way of not only neutralizing it, but bringing it over onto the faithful, positive side. So it really, truly is. It's this big, vague topic that I'm sure we'll get into, but at its core, we have to make the decision to choose it. And that, as you know, is sometimes easier said than done.
In other words, one of the biggest characteristics about gratitude is that it has to be intentional. It's not just going to happen automatically. Is that right?
You know what I think about right away from a biblical standpoint, Dan, is you got the parable of the 10 lepers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus heals all of them. By the way, he heals them while they're on the road to see the priest, right?
Yeah.
And so they all are like astonished at what he did, just like we're astonished at what he did. But then only one returns back to Jesus and personally says, thank you. You know, he personally goes the extra mile to go back to Jesus and say, I'm grateful for my healing. And so I think that's really a prominent thing and an example for us to follow. As kingdom-minded people, shouldn't we be leading the way in gratitude? And Jesus was, I think it's fair to say, his feelings were hurt. Because what does he say when the one comes back? He says, where are the other 9? So he wants that from us, to say thank you and to have hearts full of gratitude for the things he's done.
Sure. You mentioned the idea about being hurt or being encouraged when gratitude comes back. What are some of the things that you've seen that have a tendency to stand in the way of us not being grateful or not expressing gratitude?
I think it's when those negative emotions dominate our hearts. I think what I have found is when unforgiveness settles in, bitterness, worry, anxiety. Of course, the Bible has something to say about all of those. When those become the dominant emotion, they push gratitude out. But the good news is when we choose gratitude, it pushes all those others out, because as humans, we tend to only be able to hold one of those dominant emotions at a time. You can be feeling, bits and pieces of a couple of them, but usually one of them is dominant. I know that when I'm overwhelmed by worry, that's all I can think about. And if it's financial, I'm thinking about the next bill. I'm thinking about the car repair. I'm thinking about the next speaking engagement and how I'm going to get there and how God's going to provide, instead of being grateful for all that he already has done. Then is the problem still there? Yeah, the challenge is still there, but my focus is on him and gratefulness versus worry, if that makes sense.
Sure. So it sounds like it's actually possible when we are experiencing maybe a little bit of a struggle in an area outside of the current relationship that we're in, we can actually be ingrateful, if that's the right word, in a relationship, but it may not necessarily have anything to do with what's going on in that relationship. It may actually be something that's happening on another part of my life. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. what you're getting into there is some unprocessed emotions. And that could be from something that happened at work earlier today that we take home to our spouses, or that could be a situation that's been lingering since childhood that we never dealt with. And it's affected all our relationships for 30, 40 years. And we just haven't either pinpoint what it is, or we know what it is, and we don't have the tools yet to address it and fix it and be able to move on in a healthier way.
Sure. Sure. I know in my life, there are really two kinds of things that have a tendency to go on at the same time in any kind of relationship, whether it's personal or with my work or whatever. One has to do with feelings and the other one has to do with attitude. Explain or talk a little bit about how those two things either work in conjunction with one another or against one another when it comes to gratitude, attitudes, and emotions.
Well, attitudes, I mean, they tend to be, from my experience, something that's a long-term formed opinion or emotion about a situation. But the good news is you can choose gratitude at any time. I can recognize, okay, I'm having an attitude towards this situation. Okay. And this is why it's so important to have one another relationships. That's why there's, I think, 54, Paul had 54 commands in the New Testament on one another, because we weren't meant to walk the Christian life alone. So it's good for me to say, you know what, Dan, here's my heart towards this situation or this person. Let me just tell you what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and tell me, is it godly? Is there something I'm off about? What's your take on that? And you can help me with that. And in that process of you helping me with that, it's gonna, if my heart not necessarily was automatically in a bad spot, but usually when I'm having to check my heart with somebody else, there's usually room for maturity in that. And then as you give me feedback, it hopefully will soften my heart and it will help me to choose gratitude. So it's always going to come back to the condition of our heart. Is it hard? Is it bitter? Is it forgiving? Is it soft? Is it teachable? Is it humble? We want to have the same heart of Jesus. And I think really, if we just boil that down into its simplest form, you can find that in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. That's what we want to be more like. If we're going to have an attitude, let's have a good attitude, the attitude of Jesus.
So can gratitude be both an indicator of what's going on in my heart, as well as something that can actually be used to affect my heart?
Let me make sure I understand your question. So ask that again. Can gratitude affect or change my heart?
Yeah, as well as it can be an indicator of a changed heart. In other words, I'm moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think the answer is most definitely yes to both. Usually I can tell my heart needs help when I find myself complaining about little things. It tells me that, I haven't spent enough time with God that morning. I haven't been praying for other people's needs as much. I've been letting the worries of the world creep in, and I need to go back to God and thank Him for. And by the way, gratitude accumulates. You can be in a really negative spot, a really hard place in your heart. And I know this is easier said than done when you're in that spot, but if you will just get away, go sit down somewhere quiet, close your eyes for a while. And if you're one that likes to journal, this is great for this too. But even if you don't journal, just quietly talk to God about, hey, I'm grateful for I had hot water in my shower this morning, something that we would take for granted, right? We've got warm sheets on our bed in the wintertime. I know that's important in Iowa. We've got food in the pantry. And the next thing you know, those things we take for granted every day, the next thing you know, you've reeled off 10 or 15 things, because gratitude does accumulate. And so that exercise in itself has a way of softening our heart and giving us more of God's perspective.
Sure. Is there a resource that you're aware of or that you've developed that can help us on that journey of beginning to put gratitude together in our life as we move forward?
Well, I've got some specific things. In general, gratitude is one of the components that we teach in our Hurt2Hope workshops. So that content's available when you go through one of our workshops. But I've developed some content for married couples. Specifically, I have a journal that just came out a couple of months ago called "Reigniting the Gratitude in Your Marriage," which is a monthly, a 30-day journal. And then I have a coaching program that's called "Reigniting the Spark and Connection in Your Marriage in 8 weeks or Less," which is a 60-day coaching program where gratitude is the main vehicle that I use through a variety of topics that we cover in those 2 months.
Sure. Give us a little example of some of the things that you've witnessed, how a person who is pretty much void of gratitude altogether all of a sudden begins to develop and becomes to recognize things that they can be thankful for, how that changes their heart and their inner view of life itself. Give us an idea of what that looks like.
I knew a guy many years ago in a different state. I was his pastor, and he had shared some things with me that had happened in his childhood, horrific things, a lot of abuse, every kind of abuse that you could actually think of. He unfortunately had happened to him by somebody very close to him. Very, very tragic story. And the word that comes to mind, and it's not hard to do, was he told me on no uncertain terms, "Steve, I will never, ever forgive this person for what he did to me." So unforgiveness, and he's a very talented guy, had a lot of potential. Just that unforgiveness was weighing him down. And he went through our workshop, and I'm giving you the short version. But I remember it was really challenging for me because I was just getting to know him, and we would go on these prayer walks together, and it was like, it would always get brought up what happened to him. And I would get alone with God, and I was like, "God, I know you want me to speak the truth in love to him as his friend, as his pastor, but it's also a very delicate situation. To give me the right words, give me the right timing, give me the courage, all that." And I really wanted him to come to one of our workshops, and he did. And so after he went to the workshop, which he was very skeptical of, by the way, we were going on our next prayer walk a couple of weeks after the workshop, and I said, "Hey, how you doing with forgiveness of this person you were telling me about?" And he goes, "Oh, I forgave them a couple of weeks ago, during that workshop, and I'm so grateful for everything that I've learned, and I'm grateful for God's forgiveness of me and my sin and sending Jesus." It was like a light switch from unforgiveness to gratitude because he had learned how to forgive in the process.
Sure. Well, if gratitude and forgiveness can work together to bring one out of a dark area and begin to put joy into a person's life, how can ingratitude do just the opposite? Take you from a position where things are kind of going pretty good to kind of put you in a downward spiral. What does that look like, or how can you battle that?
Well, I can tell you without a ton of detail. I got in that situation 21 years ago. Where my wife and I had been married, I think let me do the math. We've been married 8 years, and I was making poor decisions. We were under some stress, but I made poor decisions in the marriage, sin on my part that led to my wife. And this is real. And she said, "Steve, if we don't address this and you don't repent," I don't think she used that word then because we weren't Christians yet. She said, I'm 48. This was on a voicemail, actually. She said, "I'm 48 hours away from seeking a divorce attorney." And I took her for granted. It's hard to admit that, but looking back 21 years later, I took her for granted, and I got complacent, and I didn't appreciate her. And by the grace of God, we became Christians. That was one of the last straws, so to speak, where we both became Christians just a couple months later. And God completely changed our lives. We're completely grateful. We have to continue to work on our marriage like everybody else does. But even with all the challenges that we have now, 21 years later, we're coming up on our 29th wedding anniversary next month. It's God's grace, but I am so grateful for her patience with me, her grace for me, and of course, God the same way. But I don't ever want to go back to that Steve and that behavior. And my gratitude for her is a large piece of that.
I know that you've got a lot of resources that we can begin to give out to people to help them work through some of these things, some books, your workshops, and we'll put all those links in the show notes as well as the YouTube description. But before we kind of sign off here, what's one thing this week that we as a support group could pray for both you and Hurt2Hope this week?
Well, I just got back from a conference in Illinois this weekend. Well, the conference was last week, and it's a conference for where we represented Hurt2Hope for ministers. And we really want to see ministers get the help that they need. What I mean by that specifically is they have unprocessed emotions that they need healing from as well. Ministers are busy. I know because I am one. They're busy. They have a lot to do. They don't invest in their own development sometimes. And we have a lot of ministers that are out there hurting, and we have a lot of churches that are wounded for various reasons. We feel like if we can get ministers to see the value of dealing with their unprocessed emotions, then they'll be more apt to take their churches through it. And then we can cast a wider net. I've got a good friend of mine that leads a church in Florida. And when he went through Hurt2Hope, he said, I thought I was bringing it in for my church. But what I didn't realize was I needed it just as much, if not more, than all of my parishioners. And so if we can get more ministers to recognize that, I think we're going to be able to help a lot of people. So that would be a great prayer.
You bet. Well, Steve, I just really want to thank you for taking the time to have a conversation with you today. It's just been wonderful stuff. Good to connect with you again. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me.
Hey, if you've got any questions or if you'd like to learn more about Steve or Hurt2Hope, you can see his contact information here on the screen. You can also find it in the show notes for this episode on our website or in the YouTube description. If you'd like to support Hurt2Hope financially, you can find links to do so both in the show notes as well as the YouTube description. And maybe if you would like to, I invite you to add Hurt2Hope and Steve to your prayer list this week, and maybe even send an email of encouragement to Steve, let him know that you're praying for him. So on behalf of Hurt2Hope, Steve Warmer, and Partners in Ministry, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And until next time, let's get out there and serve as Christ serves.